Sinister stories.
It was Halloween night when the group of 12 gathered outside the gates of Blackridge Penitentiary, a once infamous maximum security prison that had been shut down decades ago. The air was thick with the kind of eerie chill that could only be described as unnatural, as though the place had never quite let go of the lives it swallowed over the years. The sky hung low with thick clouds, occasionally illuminated by the glow of the distant moon. Blackridge had a bloody history, but none more infamous than the night of October 31st, 1944. That night, the guards had gone mad, driven to some unspeakable insanity. In a blood-soaked frenzy, they slaughtered half the prisoners before turning on one another. No one knew why it had happened or what caused the mass hysteria, but the horror was still whispered about in town. Some said it was the guards' revenge for the countless wrongs they'd suffered, while others believed something darker had crawled into the prison that night and never left. The overnight tour, led by a gaunt, skeletal guide named Mason, seemed like a macabre novelty to the group, a chance to experience a real-life haunted house with an edge. Most of the participants were thrill-seekers, looking for a Halloween scare. Others were skeptics, sneering at the ghost stories but secretly craving the adrenaline rush. They all knew about Blackridge's history. Mason had made sure to paint a gruesome picture before they entered, but no one expected more than a few jump scares, if even that. Inside, the prison was worse than they imagined. The walls were crumbling, and a foul odor permeated the air, as though the death and suffering of years past still lingered. The sound of the iron gate clanging shut behind them echoed like a warning, but no one turned back. "The anniversary," Mason rasped, his voice hollow, "is tonight. 80 years ago, this place saw more blood than most of you can imagine. It's said that the spirits of both the prisoners and the guards still walk these halls. They're waiting." A shiver ran through the group, but most laughed it off. "Spooky," one of them, a young man named Chris, mocked, nudging his girlfriend Sarah. "It's just stories." Mason's pale eyes flickered over the group. "Stories, perhaps, but this place has a way of making you believe. It's best you all stay together." The tour began, Mason leading them through dark corridors where rusted bars lined the walls like the teeth of some forgotten beast. Their footsteps echoed unnaturally, making the space seem both empty and filled at the same time. Every so often, the wind would howl through a cracked window, making it sound like someone or something was whispering just beyond earshot. As they moved deeper into the prison, Mason pointed out cells where notorious murderers had been held, the mess hall where riots had once broken out, and finally, the infamous execution chamber where hundreds of lives had ended. "This is where the madness began," Mason said, his voice low, eyes glinting. "It was here, on that Halloween night, where the first guard went mad. Witnesses said they could hear him screaming, but the sound was wrong, not human." A deep unease settled over the group. There was something oppressive in the air, something that made the walls feel closer, the shadows thicker. And then it started. A faint tapping echoed from somewhere deep in the prison. At first they thought it was just the wind, but the sound grew louder, more insistent. Tap, tap, tap. Mason frowned, pausing in mid-sentence. "That wasn't part of the tour," he muttered under his breath, barely audible. The group exchanged nervous glances. It was getting harder to laugh it off. "Maybe it's one of the other tours," said Jackie, a middle-aged woman who had been skeptical from the start. "There are no other tours tonight," Mason replied sharply. The tapping was joined by a distant creaking sound, like the groaning of old metal, coming from somewhere beyond their line of sight. The hairs on the back of everyone's neck stood on end. "We should keep moving," Mason urged, his previous bravado slipping. "This place plays tricks on you." But the group was restless. The sound had rattled them more than they cared to admit. Someone, Chris again, suggested they split up. "Cover more ground, get more of a scare. It's what we're here for, right?" Mason's face paled. "I wouldn't recommend that. This isn't a place to wander alone." But the group, emboldened by the atmosphere or perhaps the desire to prove their bravery, disagreed. They split into pairs and small groups, laughing off the old man's warnings. "I didn't think this would be that freaky," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. Chris squeezed her hand. "It's just old metal settling." But as they continued, the tapping sound returned, louder now, coming from the walls themselves. The thin corridor amplified it, making it seem as though 100 fingers were drumming against the concrete. Then, without warning, all the lights in their flashlights flickered and died, plunging them into darkness. In another part of the prison, Jackie and her friend Greg had wandered into the shower block. The air was heavy with humidity, and the tiles gleamed wetly, though there hadn't been water running in this place for decades. As they moved deeper into the room, they began to hear faint whispers, indistinct at first but growing clearer with each step. Jackie's skepticism faltered when she heard her name, clear as day, in the voice of a child. She whipped around, but there was no one there. Greg, too, was pale now, his bravado evaporating in the face of something neither of them could explain. Back in the main hall, a group of 4 had ventured toward the old cafeteria. The smell hit them before they even stepped through the door, a rancid, overwhelming stench of decay. It was so strong that one of them, a girl named Melissa, gagged and covered her mouth. "What the hell is that?" she whispered, eyes watering. No one answered. Instead, they were drawn to the far end of the room where something was dripping from the ceiling, dark and thick, like oil. But when they stepped closer, they realized it wasn't oil at all. It was blood, slowly pooling on the cracked tile floor. "Let's get out of here," one of the others whispered. But the moment they turned to leave, they froze. All around them, the cafeteria doors were slowly swinging shut, the sound of heavy chains rattling in the dim light. Panic rippled through the group. They bolted for the nearest exit, but the doors wouldn't budge, as if something was holding them shut from the other side. In the solitary wing, Chris and Sarah were still in pitch darkness, unable to see even an inch in front of their faces. Sarah was trembling, gripping Chris's arm tightly. They tried to find their way back, but the walls seemed to shift around them, the air growing thick and suffocating. The tapping sound had returned, now so loud that it drowned out everything else. Suddenly, a scream echoed through the prison, a high-pitched wail that sent shivers down their spines. It wasn't from any of their group. It was something else. Something wrong. "We need to go," Sarah gasped, her voice breaking. They began to run, blindly stumbling through the dark hallways, but no matter where they turned, they couldn't find the way out. The walls felt closer, pressing in on them, and the air grew impossibly cold. And then they saw it. A figure standing at the end of the hallway, its silhouette barely visible in the dim glow of a single flickering light. "Who's there?" Chris called out, his voice cracking. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, staring. And then, in a voice that echoed unnaturally through the hall, it whispered, "You're not supposed to be here." Suddenly, the flickering light went out, and the figure was gone. In the pitch-black silence, all they could hear was the relentless tapping, now coming from inside the walls, all around them. Elsewhere in the prison, similar horrors were unfolding. The whispers in the shower block grew louder, calling out in voices that Greg and Jackie knew all too well, voices of people they'd lost long ago. In the cafeteria, the group was frantically trying to force the doors open, but something unseen held them shut, the blood on the floor spreading toward their feet. Everywhere, the air was thick with the feeling of being watched, of something old and angry rising from the hollow walls. When the survivors finally regrouped in the main hall, breathless and terrified, they realized something chilling. 3 of them were missing, and Mason, their guide, was nowhere to be found. The prison had gone deathly silent. No more tapping, no more whispers, just an oppressive, suffocating quiet. As they stood there, trying to make sense of what had happened, the lights flickered once more, and in that brief flickering light, they saw it. Scrawled across the wall in what looked like blood were words that hadn't been there before. "You can't leave." The lights went out again, plunging them into total darkness. Panic gripped them. Someone was whispering frantically, but the words didn't register. Their breaths came in short, ragged gasps, echoing in the suffocating silence. They all stood frozen, waiting, listening, but the silence stretched on, deeper, more oppressive. "Where's Mason?" Melissa whispered shakily, her voice barely audible. No one answered. In truth, no one had seen Mason for what felt like hours. He had been with them, leading them deeper into the bowels of the prison, and then, without anyone noticing, he was simply gone. The whispers returned. This time they were unmistakable, curling around them like smoke, faint but insistent. "You shouldn't have come," they heard in a raspy, inhuman voice. The words slid through the darkness, making their skin crawl. "We have to leave," Greg insisted, backing toward the nearest door. "We have to." But before he could finish, the sound came again, the tapping. This time it wasn't distant. It wasn't coming from the walls. It was coming from inside the room with them. Tap, tap, tap. It sounded like bony fingers drumming against the concrete, slowly, rhythmically. Everyone's heads jerked toward the source, but the darkness was absolute. Then came a soft, shuffling sound, as if something or someone was moving toward them. "Who's there?" Jackie whispered, her voice shaking. No answer. "Where's Chris?" Sarah asked suddenly, her voice panicked. She spun around, searching the darkness. "He was just here!" "Chris?" Melissa called out, her voice wavering. "Chris, where are you?" There was just silence. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. It felt closer. "I don't like this," Greg muttered, his hands trembling as he fumbled with his phone's flashlight. The beam flickered on, casting a weak circle of light in front of them. But there was nothing, no one in sight. "We need to get out of here," Jackie said, her voice hoarse. "We need to find a way out, now." They stumbled through the hall, their nerves frayed, their movements frantic. But every hallway looked the same, each turn leading them deeper into the labyrinthine prison. The walls seemed to pulse around them, closing in, warping as though the building itself was alive and watching them, waiting for the right moment to strike. And the further they went, the more the air thickened with that sickly sweet smell of decay. It clung to their skin, their clothes suffocating them. Then, without warning, Melissa screamed. The light from Greg's phone illuminated what had startled her, a door, half open, and just beyond it, a figure slumped on the floor. It was Chris. His eyes were wide open, staring at nothing, his face contorted in terror. His throat was torn open, the blood pooled beneath him thick and black, still fresh. "Chris!" Sarah shrieked, rushing toward him, but Greg grabbed her arm, pulling her back. "No, we need to go!" But she broke free, falling to her knees beside Chris, shaking him, crying out his name. He didn't move, didn't blink. His cold, dead eyes locked on some unseen horror, his mouth frozen in a silent scream. "We have to go!" Greg shouted, his voice cracking. "He's gone!" Sarah looked up, tears streaming down her face, but her gaze shifted over Greg's shoulder, and her expression twisted into something worse than grief. Fear. Pure primal fear. "Behind you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Greg's blood ran cold. Slowly he turned, his flashlight shaking in his hand, the beam sweeping over the darkness. And there it was. Standing at the end of the hallway, just out of reach of the light, was a figure. Its face was pale, twisted, almost inhuman, its eyes glowing faintly in the dark. It stood unnaturally still, its head cocked to one side, watching them with an eerie, predatory silence. "What is that?" Jackie breathed, her voice trembling. The figure didn't move, but its presence filled the hallway with an unbearable sense of dread, a suffocating weight that pressed down on them, freezing them in place. And then, it started to move. Slowly, deliberately, it stepped forward, its feet dragging along the cold concrete floor, the sound like nails scraping against a chalkboard. "Run!" Greg yelled, snapping out of his paralysis. He grabbed Sarah's arm and pulled her to her feet, and the group bolted, tearing down the hallway, the tapping sound following them, growing louder, faster, more insistent. Tap, tap, tap. They didn't know where they were running. They didn't care. All they knew was that they had to get away, had to escape the thing that was following them. But the prison seemed to shift around them, twisting, turning, leading them in circles. No matter how far they ran, they couldn't find the exit. "Where are we?" Melissa cried, her voice breaking. "We've been here before." "Just keep going," Greg shouted, his heart pounding in his chest. But even as they ran, he knew it was hopeless. The walls were closing in, the darkness pressing against them, and the tapping, the relentless tapping, was all around them now, echoing from every direction. Suddenly, the hallway opened up into a large room, the ceiling towering high above them, the remnants of a chapel long abandoned. The group stumbled to a stop, gasping for breath, their eyes darting around the room, searching for a way out, but there was none. The doors had sealed shut behind them, and the figure was standing in the doorway, its eyes glowing faintly, its head tilted as though listening to something only it could hear. For a moment, no one moved, no one breathed, and then the figure spoke. "You were never meant to leave," it rasped, its voice like the creak of ancient wood. The group backed away, their eyes wide with horror, but there was nowhere to go. The walls seemed to ripple, the shadows stretching, twisting into shapes that moved on their own. And then the lights flickered, just for a moment. In that brief flash, they saw the truth. The prison wasn't empty. It had never been empty. The walls, the floors, the very air around them were alive with the spirits of the dead. Prisoners, guards, men who had died screaming in madness and rage. Their faces, twisted in agony, pressed against the walls, their hands reaching out, clawing at the air, their whispers filling the room with an unbearable cacophony of despair. The lights flickered again and the figure was gone, but the tapping remained, closer, louder. And then, as the shadows closed in around them, the doors to the chapel swung open. But it wasn't freedom waiting on the other side. It was the hollow, echoing laughter of something far worse than death, and the tapping never stopped. The laughter echoed through the chapel, reverberating off the cold stone walls, making the air itself shiver. It was a sound so wrong, so otherworldly, that it seemed to reach deep inside their bones and twist something vital. The group stood frozen, their hearts pounding, their breaths shallow, waiting for the next horror to strike. But it wasn't over, far from it. Greg was the first to step toward the now open doors, drawn by the terrible, almost hypnotic sound. It was as if something was calling him, urging him forward. He knew he shouldn't go, but his feet moved of their own accord, dragging him closer to the dark void that lay beyond. "Greg, don't!" Jackie hissed, her voice trembling. She reached out to stop him, but he jerked away, his face pale, eyes wide and unblinking. "I have to," he muttered, his voice hollow. "There's no other way." The others watched helplessly as he moved forward, disappearing into the inky blackness beyond the doors. For a moment, the laughter stopped. Then a scream, Greg's scream, pierced the silence, a sound so raw and primal that it sent chills down their spines. It cut off abruptly, leaving only the oppressive quiet in its wake. "Oh God," Sarah whispered, her voice breaking. "What's happening? What's happening?" Melissa shook her head, backing away from the door. "We need to get out of here. Now. We're not staying to find out." But just as she turned, the chapel doors slammed shut again with a deafening bang, sealing them inside. The air grew thick with the scent of rot, the decay of something long dead but still clinging to this world. A low, guttural voice echoed through the room, but it wasn't coming from the figure anymore. It seemed to be coming from everywhere at once. "You were never alone. You never will be." The walls seemed to pulse, and the whispers returned, louder, clearer now. Names, unintelligible phrases, fragments of sentences. Sarah's eyes darted to the corners of the room where shadowy figures were emerging. Prisoners, guards, their faces twisted in silent screams, their bodies battered and broken, their hollow eyes locked on the living. They moved toward the group slowly, their limbs jerking unnaturally, as if they were being pulled by invisible strings. "We have to," Jackie started, but she never finished. The lights flickered, and in that brief strobe of light, Melissa was gone. One moment she was standing right beside them, and the next, she had vanished into the suffocating darkness. The others stared in shock, disbelief filling their faces. "Melissa?" Sarah called out, her voice trembling with desperation. "Melissa, where are you?" But there was no answer, only the tapping, always the tapping. Tap, tap, tap. It was louder now, almost like a heartbeat, surrounding them, enveloping them. Sarah's breath came in panicked gasps as she backed away from the shifting shadows. Jackie stood frozen, her eyes wide, scanning the room for any sign of Melissa or Greg. Then, slowly, the figure reappeared. It stood in the center of the room now, closer than ever, its glowing eyes fixed on Sarah. "Why are you doing this?" she whispered, her voice breaking. The figure tilted its head again, its lips pulling back in a grotesque smile. Because you've been here before. You belong here." Before Sarah could respond, the floor beneath her feet shifted, as if the prison itself had become something fluid, alive. She stumbled, reaching out for Jackie, but Jackie was already moving, toward the door, toward some imagined safety that surely didn't exist. As Jackie's hand gripped the door handle, she yanked it open with a surge of hope. But beyond the threshold wasn't the hallway they had come from. It wasn't anything they recognized. It was a vast, empty void, the sound of distant wailing filling the air, a darkness so deep it swallowed the light from her flashlight entirely. She stepped back, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. And then she heard it, Melissa's voice, faint and desperate, calling from somewhere in that abyss. "Help me?" Jackie froze, her hand trembling on the door. "Melissa, where are you?" "Please," the voice begged. "It hurts." Against every instinct screaming at her to stay away, Jackie took a tentative step toward the darkness, her flashlight flickering wildly in her hand. She leaned forward, squinting into the void, searching for any sign of her friend. But what stepped out wasn't Melissa. The thing that emerged had Melissa's face, but it was twisted, wrong, the features warped into something grotesque. Her eyes were empty, hollow, her mouth stretching into an unnatural smile. The voice that came from her lips wasn't Melissa's anymore. "You'll be with us soon." Jackie stumbled back, her breath catching in her throat, but it was too late. The thing lunged toward her, its hands reaching, its fingers too long, too sharp. She screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the room as the door slammed shut again. Sarah stood frozen, tears streaming down her face, her mind shattered by everything she had just witnessed. Jackie's scream still echoed in her ears, but the room was silent again. Tap, tap, tap. She turned slowly, her body shaking, and there it was again. The figure, standing only a few feet away now, its glowing eyes locked on hers. "You were always meant to stay," it whispered. The floor beneath her feet seemed to crack, and through the gaps, she could see the writhing mass of souls trapped below, reaching out, grasping, pulling at her ankles, dragging her down into the depths. "No," she whispered, shaking her head violently. "No, I'm not staying, I'm not—" But the figure only smiled wider, the darkness growing around it, swallowing the room, swallowing the world. And then, just as suddenly, everything went quiet. The tapping stopped, the shadows retreated. Sarah found herself standing alone in the chapel, the flickering light of her flashlight barely illuminating the room. Greg, Jackie, Melissa, everyone was gone. She was alone, or so she thought. A cold breeze swept through the room, carrying with it the faintest of whispers. "You never left." The light flickered once more, and in the dim glow, Sarah saw her reflection in a cracked, dirty mirror on the wall. But it wasn't her. The face staring back at her was hollow-eyed, twisted, like the others, like the dead. Her mouth opened in a silent scream. The lights went out, leaving her in complete darkness, and the tapping started again. Tap, tap, tap. Then the room went silent, and the lights flickered only to reveal complete emptiness.